Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet. We're very pleased to have with us today Professor Daniel Lyons from Boston College Law School. Before I introduce Professor Lyons, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, we're very pleased, let me announce two upcoming events. Richard Wiley, former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, will speak to the center on February 19th here at noon. On March 9th, Commissioner Ajit Pai of the Federal Communications Commission will speak again here at noon. We are online as usual today, and online viewers can send in questions, and it's hashtag Hudson Institute for our online viewers today. Very pleased to have with us today Professor Daniel Lyons, who will speak to us about usage-based pricing, which has become a very hot topic here in Washington. Professor Lyons has written a wonderful paper, which we will make available at our website. He is going to be speaking about his paper today. So let me turn things over to Professor Lyons.
Thank you much.
Please.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to address you guys today. I appreciate the invitation. I want to talk a little bit today about usage-based pricing for broadband service. So in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen broadband providers begin to shift away from the all-you-can-eat model for broadband pricing access. Right, so instead, they're moving to plans that in some way or another are charging consumers on the basis of network use. Now, at the time, when this shift started about 4 or 5 years ago, the move was relatively uncontroversial. So much of the industry was engaged in the battle over net neutrality, and so usage-based pricing didn't receive a lot of fanfare. And I think in part because just about everybody involved in the discussion thought it was a pretty positive move. So Larry Lessig and Tim Wu, who were sort of the intellectual godfathers of the net neutrality movement, they both endorsed the practice. And the FCC's net neutrality order recognized the value that usage-based pricing brings to consumers. And indeed, FTC Chairman John Leibowitz expressed his surprise that the industry took so long to move to a metered pricing regime. And so you fast forward a few short years, and the practice, I think, has become more controversial. So several consumer rights groups are beginning to challenge the practice, concerned that broadband providers are, or may be, abusing usage-based pricing in order to pad profits and avoid the cost of future network upgrades. They also fear that fixed broadband providers are going to use usage-based pricing in order to shield legacy cable businesses from competition from over-the-top providers like Netflix. And so in the middle of last year, the Justice Department opened an investigation into the practice. And just last month, right, Senator Wyden introduced a bill that would regulate usage-based pricing and limit its use. So the crux of my remarks today is to sort of push back on that. And the theme that you'll find is throughout today's discussion is that there's nothing inherently anti-consumer or anti-competitive about data caps, tiered pricing, or other forms of usage-based broadband pricing. Rather, they reflect, I think, different pricing strategies through which a broadband company can recover its costs from consumers and fund future infrastructure investment. By aligning costs more closely with use, usage-based pricing can shift more of the network costs onto those who use the network the most. And companies can thus avoid the phenomenon of light internet users subsidizing the data-heavy habits of those who spend more time online watching movies or engaging in BitTorrent traffic and things like that. And usage-based pricing can also help alleviate network congestion by encouraging customers and content providers and ultimately network operators to use their broadband facilities more effectively. Now, without question, right, data caps can be used in anti-competitive ways. But this is really only a problem where the firm has market power and abuses that market power in a way that that adversely harms consumers. Absent a specific market failure, which I don't think critics have yet shown, broadband providers should be free to experiment with usage-based pricing and with other forms of pricing strategies as tools to try to meet the challenge of rising broadband demand. So public policy is allowing providers the freedom to experiment best preserve the spirit of innovation that I think has characterized the internet since its inception. All right, so let's back up a bit, right? What is usage-based pricing? But generally speaking, usage-based pricing is an umbrella term for any system that bills consumers on the basis of consumption. And although the internet abandoned usage-based pricing pretty early on in the mid-90s, it's a fairly common practice in several network industries. So for example, many long-distance telephone providers historically charge consumers a fixed rate per minute of talk time. And veterans of the late 80s, 90s telephone wars remember that the price per minute, right, 10 cents a minute, 5 cents a minute, was a key point of competition among the upstarts who were challenging the old AT&T monopoly. And so that's a relatively simple form of metered pricing. But companies can use more sophisticated variants, right, in order to try to use pricing to shape consumer behavior. So for example, those same telephone companies sometimes offered plans including free night and weekend minutes. And it was in part to try to induce customers to shift their calling patterns to time periods when the telephone network was relatively underutilized. Right, and similarly, electricity companies will often charge peak and off-peak rates for electricity use, and the goal is to try to get consumers to shift non-essential consumption to off hours when there's more slack in the network and one customer's use is not putting a tremendous amount of strain on the network as a whole. Now, another common alternative that you see is a two-part tariff, where a customer pays a fixed charge for access to a network and then another fee per unit for consumption on that network. The two-part tariffs are relatively useful for network operators because the fixed charge helps the company assure that consumers are going to pay some amount, relatively predictable amount each month toward the fixed cost of the network. And the consumption fee covers the marginal cost of additional use, right? A lot of wireless telephone plans are a form of a two-part tariff. Customers purchase a plan for a fixed fee that includes a certain number of minutes per month, and they're allowed to engage in unlimited calling each month up to that limit, and if they exceed the limit, then the customer pays an additional per minute charge. Right? It's not a difficult phenomenon. And in the fixed broadband market, some companies are also moving toward a similar two-part tariff, and it's commonly called a data cap, although I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Perhaps most obviously or most famously, Comcast introduced its data cap in 2008, and it was at the time limiting broadband customers to 250 gigabytes per month. So if you had a plan from Comcast and you were a residential broadband customer, you were allowed to use up to 250 gigabytes per month of data before some adverse action from the company. And this was what we might call a hard data cap. Comcast's position was that if you were able to consume up to the limit, and if you exceeded the limit, then we could take some action against you. They reserved the right to terminate your access if you violated the cap multiple times. The record is unclear as to how often Comcast actually enforced those rights, but it was company policy at the time. Now, this past year, Comcast abandoned its 250 gig cap and is now test marketing a 300 gigabyte cap, but it's a soft cap. And what do I mean by soft cap? Rather than terminating your access if you exceed the cap, you're allowed to go over the cap if you, as a consumer, choose to do so, but you pay some financial penalty, an overage charge for doing so. Right, now, data caps, well, I should note that Comcast isn't the only company doing this, right? AT&T, CenturyLink, Time Warner are also experimenting with data caps in the fixed broadband space. Now, data caps can shape consumer behavior, but only if the customer understands how much data he or she is using each month, right? So according to Sandvine, which tracks internet behavior by residential customers, among other things, the average household used about 51 gigabytes of data per month in 2012. So what this means is you'd have to use 6 times as much data as the average household before ever triggering Comcast's current 300 gigabyte limit. So if we try to figure out for what that means in terms of day-to-day operations, Netflix estimates that streaming video consumers use about somewhere between 0.3 and 1 gigabyte per hour for watching standard definition television, and their HD content streams at about 2.3 gigabytes per hour. So in order to hit the 300 gig limit, you'd need to stream about 130 hours of HD content each month, or somewhere between 2 and 3 feature-length movies each day. Or alternatively, be viewing somewhere between 300 and 1,000 hours of non-HD content. So it's not impossible, right? These are limits that some consumers may approach, but it's not likely. It's certainly not a limit that threatens the average consumer. That's sort of the point I'm trying to make. Usage-based pricing, I think, is much more common on the wireless side, and this is where the rubber hits the road for many of us who have these little guys, right? When Apple introduced the smartphone revolution, when it launched the iPhone, AT&T and its competitors, I think, were unprepared for the flood of wireless data demand that these devices were going to create. So I'd read somewhere recently that these use somewhere around 8 times as much data as a typical phone, and these little babies, right, somewhere near 108 times. And so the more of these types of smart devices get added to the wireless network, it's order of magnitude greater, the demand that each of these is putting on the existing wireless infrastructure. And so in part because of capacity issues, because demand was growing much faster than the companies could build capacity to meet it, most wireless providers have now moved to tiered pricing models. So consumers are given a choice of different monthly data caps that they might get for particular flat rates, and they're allowed to consume up to the cap that they chose in exchange for the fixed payment and pay an overage charge if they use above the cap. So I guess one question that comes out from this sort of short history of telecom lesson, right, is why are we seeing this sudden shift toward usage-based pricing after so many years with an unlimited flat rate model? And the answer, I think, stems in part from recent shifts in the way we use the internet in our daily lives, both quantitative shifts and qualitative shifts, right? We're spending more time online, but we're spending more time online doing things that we used to do offline. And so to back up just really quickly and look at the economics of the flat rate model, right? At its core, the unlimited flat rate, all-you-can-eat model is relatively inefficient. Because costs are not tied to use, flat rate pricing encourages consumers to overconsume. And that's something that anybody who's been to an all-you-can-eat buffet understands, right? You see that. That was a joke, right? All right, thank you. But there were distributional effects as well, right? That's not the only inefficiency that we see in the system. One of the big challenges, and one that the average consumer doesn't always see, is the fact that under a one flat rate unlimited pricing, unlimited use model, right, it forces lighter users to pay a disproportionate share of overall network costs. The FCC noted this in its net neutrality order in 2010, right, requiring all subscribers to pay the same amount for broadband service, regardless of the performance or the usage of that service, would force lighter end users of the network to subsidize heavier end users. And so heavier end users are consuming more of the network's total capacity than lighter users, and yet they pay the same amount per month to cover the network's fixed costs. So what that means is that lighter users wind up paying more per megabyte used, right? Or to put it another way, flat rate pricing forces lighter users to purchase more bandwidth than they need. Now, this inefficiency has sort of always been there, as long as flat rate pricing was the dominant pricing model in broadband access. But nobody really cared when most of us were using the web primarily or internet primarily for web browsing and email. Right, there were periods of occasional spikes. When Michael Jackson died, everybody rushed to the internet to get information and almost broke the internet, was the New York Times headline. But for the most part, there was not a huge gap between the heaviest 5% of users and the lightest 5% of the users in terms of total bandwidth consumption. All of us were using the internet at different rates, but the gap between heaviest and lightest was relatively small, and in aggregate, we weren't demanding more of the internet than existing networks had capacity to handle. But the rise of streaming video and other real-time entertainment options has put substantial strains on the network. And it's widened that gap considerably between the heaviest and the lightest users. So the most recent analysis we see by Sandvine suggests that in aggregate, real-time entertainment, things like Netflix streaming video and Pandora, internet, radio, and services like that, consume almost 60% of aggregate traffic in North America on fixed broadband networks today. And Sandvine's estimating that for fixed wireless providers, for fixed broadband providers, the top 1% of users are consuming 13% of all downstream traffic and 38% of all upstream traffic. So 1% of users consuming between 13 and 38%. By comparison, the bottom 50% of users, right, my parents, my grandparents, people who are still paying through the nose like everybody else for broadband access, are only in aggregate consuming about 5% total traffic. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. Let me come back to that in Q&A because I think there's a good response to that. Yeah, VPN. So using your private computer to log into your computer at work, and yeah. And so yeah, the point is there's this huge disparity, right, between the top heavy internet users and those of us who are sort of at the average amount of internet use each month or below average. And the gap's even greater in wireless, right? Which is not a surprise. The people who have smartphones love their smartphones, and the people who don't really get it. They don't really understand. Not that they don't get it in a pejorative sense. They don't get it in a descriptive sense, right? They don't understand why those of us who have phones are obsessed with them. But what it means is that the bottom 50% of us with mobile plans are responsible for less than 1% of total traffic, which is astounding once I read that. So what this means is that half of America that uses below average internet use makes up about 5% of total traffic, and yet they pay the same amount per month as those who are taking up 95% of the network's resources. And the gap's even wider in wireless, right? So given this wide disparity in usage, companies are beginning to experiment with pricing plans that are going to eliminate this cross-subsidy and shift more of the network's costs onto those consumers, right, the upper half of users that are using the network the most. Now, some have objected that we probably shouldn't be in the business of charging heavy users more because heavy users, although they're using more capacity on the network, they're not consuming, they're not imposing any additional marginal costs, right? Because of statistical multiplexing, things like that, many of us can use the internet at the same time without affecting, adding additional cost to the network. And except in periods of congestion, that's largely true. But I think it's also largely irrelevant to the question of how to price broadband. Because if you price broadband at marginal cost, right, everybody just pays the amount that their incremental use imposes on the network provider, then you're never going to recover the fixed costs of building out a broadband network. And these fixed costs are significant. Right, some analysts have predicted that broadband providers have spent upward of $300 billion over the last 10 years to build not just fiber optic fixed broadband lines, but also 2G and then 3G and then 4G wireless broadband networks. And these costs aren't sort of one-time sunk costs that they're now reaping the benefits of. Cisco estimates that American internet traffic is going to triple between now and 2016. And that wireless traffic is going to grow 16 times the next 4 years. And so to keep up with demand, analysts, at least some analysts, are predicting an additional $30 to $40 billion each year in incremental infrastructure, in incremental capacity in order to make sure that our capacity meets that growth in demand. So everybody agrees that network operators need to recover these costs, and everyone agrees they need to be able to fund future network upgrades. So what we're really talking about, right, is what the right strategy is to recover those fixed costs. Flat rate pricing is one strategy, and it's built on the principle of equitable distribution of fixed costs, right? Everybody using it pays the same amount. And that's attractive, right? It sort of appeals to our democratic ideals, but it's not, I think, been proven that this is the only strategy available or even the best pricing strategy available. So usage-based pricing reflects what economists would call price discrimination. Price discrimination occurs when companies sell similar goods to different buyers based on their willingness to pay rather than on their cost of service. Or in economic terms, it's when companies' sales exhibit different ratios of price to cost. So price discrimination stems from the recognition that different customers have different, what we call reservation prices, right? The maximum price that a customer is willing to pay in order to get a good. And the idea behind price discrimination is if you can figure out a way to sort customers by reservation price, you can recover more of your fixed costs from customers with higher reservation prices and less from those with lower reservation prices. Now, the success of a price discrimination regime depends first on the firm's ability to identify customers and sort them by reservation price, and then to adopt some sort of pricing strategy that will charge those with higher prices more and those with lower reservation prices less. I'll say that price discrimination gets a bad rap in part because it sort of sounds sinister, right? Anything with the word discrimination, it's a bad idea. It was my sincere hope that folks on the economic side of the debate come up with a better term than price discrimination to describe what's going on here. They've not yet done so. And so I'm sort of stuck with it, and I have to explain why it is that, although it's discrimination, it's not a bad idea. And I'll tell you that it's a fairly common practice in our society, in many parts of the economy. So when I flew down here in December, and some of you heard the story, 2 seats over from me was a student. Right? So when you fly out of Boston, you'll learn that there are times when 50% of all seats are filled by students. And so I'm reading my notes, I'm getting ready for a talk, kind of like this one. And she leans over to me and she explains to me that she's flying home to see family, and it's super cheap, right? It's $140 round trip from Boston to National. Now, my first thought is, bragging about price like this to total strangers, kind of socially awkward, it's really weird. Then I realized, a law professor calling somebody else socially awkward is kind of a pot and kettle situation. But then it occurred to me, like, this is a perfect anecdote to stick into this talk, right? Because I paid a lot more than $140 for my ticket, and I paid a lot more for the one that brought me down today. But it's classic second-degree price discrimination at work. So the airline's cost to transport me and to transport this student are the same, right? And in fact, their marginal cost is probably pretty close to zero, right? The plane's going to fly from Boston to National no matter what. Me being on the flight adds some sort of incremental weight that might throw off the fuel economy use, and they have to give me a snack. Right, but beyond that, the marginal cost of flying me here is almost nothing, and her the same. The plane would have flown even if it hadn't had either of us. Yet they charge her $140. They charge me quite a bit more because they know that she wasn't really willing to pay all that much for her ticket, and I had to be at a meeting to give a talk, and so I had to be here at a certain time. Right? The airline knows this. They charge us different prices. Everybody knows they charge us different prices. And everybody knows about it, and nobody cares. And that's sort of the idea, that sort of notion that we should be able to charge folks based on their willingness to pay is what's feeding the usage-based pricing model as well. Now, economists will tell you that price discrimination has ambiguous effects on social welfare, but that most price discrimination of the type that I describe here is socially beneficial. And the reason is because it allows companies to expand output to those who have very low reservation prices, customers that it would be profitable to serve but are not willing to pay what the flat rate price would be. So to go back to the airline example, right? Assume that the flight from Boston to DC costs the airline $300 per customer. Right, so this covers the small marginal costs, the snacks, and some pro rata portion of the fixed costs, right? Labor, the fuel, the installment payment on the plane, that sort of thing. Because the airline engages in price discrimination, I paid more than $300 for my ticket. And because I'm contributing more toward the airline's fixed costs, they can afford to sell a ticket below that amount to my student frenemy who is 2 seats away. Right? If instead it was mandated that the airline provide flat rate pricing, it means that they would charge everybody $300, right? Or probably something more than that. The fact that the airline was willing to sell the student a ticket at $140 suggests that $300 is not a price that's going to fill the entire airline. And so it means that those with reservation prices below the flat rate price wouldn't be given the opportunity to take advantage of the service. They would either have to pay more or they would not fly at all, even though they're willing to pay enough to cover the marginal cost and to contribute something toward the fixed cost of the airline, but not enough to meet the flat rate amount. So in this way, price discrimination allows the airline to expand service to students and to low-income travelers and to others who are profitable but have reservation prices below the flat rate price. And it's the hope that usage-based pricing would allow a similar phenomenon to take place in broadband. By charging heavier users more, broadband providers could offer a lower tier of service and thus narrow what we call the broadband penetration gap, right? By being able to offer service to low-income consumers or consumers who are not low-income but have a low reservation price for broadband service, consumers who are unwilling to pay a certain amount for unlimited internet access, but may be willing to pay a smaller amount for some amount of internet access short of unlimited, right? And empirical evidence suggests that, in fact, usage-based pricing does expand output in broadband. So a 2010 study by Scott Walston and James Rizzo of 25,000 broadband plans in OECD countries where tiered pricing and data caps were much more common than here shows that on average, customers with tiered or capped plans paid $164 less per year than plans that offered a similar level of service but without a data cap. And when you look at triple play plans, plans that offer broadband, voice, and video together, capped plans were on average $152 less per year than uncapped plans. And so if allowing caps and allowing price discrimination meant that the capped plans were a lower price, it meant that broadband access was being offered to more consumers, namely those consumers whose reservation prices were roughly $164 lower than what it would have been if one flat rate for unlimited service was the only option available to customers. And so usage-based pricing can also be, I think, more efficient than flat rate pricing because it's a way in which network operators can approximate what we call Ramsey pricing. So Ramsey pricing is a concept that's familiar to analysts in several high fixed cost industries. In economic terms, the idea is basic rudimentary economics 101 that I think I remember. Perfect competition occurs when prices are set at marginal cost, right? So if everybody's paying just the amount to the marginal cost of their consumption, then you end up with perfect competition and output is maximized. But as we noted earlier, in the broadband space, right, marginal cost pricing doesn't work because the customers need to be contributing to the fixed costs. And so what Frank Ramsey proposed, or rather what other people did with Frank Ramsey's work, was suggesting that in order to recover those fixed costs, what you ought to do is raise prices in a way that minimizes the distortion to consumption that occurs at marginal cost. And what that means is raising prices in inverse proportion to elasticity of demand. Or in plain English, right, raise prices more on those who are willing to pay and less on those who are not willing to pay more. Because that way you preserve the same ratio of consumption that occurs at marginal cost pricing. And so Ramsey pricing has been a goal of telecom providers for any number of years, and usage-based pricing is a way to approximate Ramsey pricing in the broadband market. By charging on the basis of consumption, providers can begin to determine which customers are relatively demand inelastic, those customers whose use of the internet will not change if their price goes up. And because they're paying more for their use, the network operator is recovering more fixed costs from the inelastic set of customers, which allows them to lower prices or at least not add a lot of fixed costs onto those who are relatively price elastic, who would drop off the network if prices went up beyond above marginal consumption. So that's the story of usage-based pricing from a price discrimination allocation of costs analysis. But usage-based pricing also holds out the possibility of alleviating network congestion. Right, so as I've noticed above, right, we talked about it a little bit earlier, when people are not charged on the basis of use, they tend to overconsume in order to get their money's worth. And there are times when this can adversely affect other users because bandwidth is ultimately a shared resource that all consumers have in common. The broadband is what economist James Buchanan calls a club good. A club good is a good that exhibits some characteristics of a private good and some characteristics of a public good. Like a private good, a club good is excludable. Right? So that means the owner can prevent customers who have not paid from accessing the service. So that distinguishes club goods from purely public goods, things like national defense or broadcast television that people can free ride on. And from common pool resources, things like fishing in a city-owned lake or something like that. But club goods, unlike private goods, are non-rivalrous. That means that when they can be shared by more than one person at the same time. So that distinguishes them from things like food or clothing. Now, Buchanan, I think, ultimately won a Nobel Prize for coming up with this idea of the club good and relating it to the notion of the community swimming pool. Right? Lots of people can use it, but the city can charge access for it. When I pay and go in, my use does not necessarily prevent you from doing the same, right? And other economists have suggested that things like the cinema, cable television, also fit the club good category. And I'd posit that broadband access also sort of falls into the phenomenon known as club goods. But because of these characteristics, because it's excludable but non-rivalrous, right, club goods are often affected by congestion costs, the marginal cost of additional network use. And as implied by their name, right, congestion costs are the costs that one consumer's use imposes on other consumers. To use the swimming pool example, right, if there's nobody in the pool and I come in and use it, I'm not really interfering with anybody else. But once 150 of us get into the pool, right, each additional person who adds in adds to the congestion of the pool and makes it hard for all of us who are there to use it. And so congestion costs will occur in broadband access as well. Right, so when the network's lightly loaded, congestion costs are essentially zero. But when the network is running near full capacity, each additional user on the network can cause congestion costs in the form of packet delays or packet loss that can be fairly substantial. It's like when the thing starts skipping like that, right? When the streaming video starts to skip because you're losing packets. Now, unlimited flat rate plans can increase congestion costs because consumers are not directly paying for the costs that they're imposing on the network. Right? When I go onto a network that's operating near full capacity and I start streaming a high-definition Netflix movie, I may be aware that the network is somewhat congested because it doesn't stream as cleanly as it does in periods of low capacity. But the cost that I'm paying as far as degradation of the Netflix service is not the full cost that my use is imposing on the network because I'm slowing everybody else down too, and I don't see those costs because I'm not paying for my additional consumption. And so when a broadband provider faces congestion, they can solve in one of two different ways, right? You can either add network capacity or you can ration access. If congestion occurs relatively regularly, the provider should increase capital in order to expand the network and provide more bandwidth to all users. But if congestion is relatively infrequent, expansion can be an inefficient solution, right? Because it leads to significant expenditures for additional capacity that lies dormant most of the time. And so in that situation, rationing may be a better solution because it encourages consumers and network owners to manage existing capacity more efficiently. And so usage-based pricing is one of those ways that can lead consumers to internalize their congestion costs and encourage them to make consumption decisions that better reflect the costs that those decisions put on the network. Right? And as consumers become more sensitive to bandwidth use and they appreciate not just the amount of bandwidth that they're using with each activity, but the cost that that puts on the network as a whole, they'll begin to demand more efficient data use from content and application providers, companies like Netflix, right? Get them to send things through better compression technologies, for example, to use a smaller broadband footprint when delivering goods to end users. They have no incentive to do that under a flat rate model. And we saw a natural experiment in this regard when data caps became predominant in Canada, and Netflix shortly afterward introduced different options for streaming for customers. They could stream standard definition at one rate or high definition at another rate. It's not an option that was really available to them before customers started facing data caps and started demanding that of video providers. And everybody in Canada benefits from the fact that now consumers have different options because it means that the aggregate amount of space that Netflix takes up in the Canadian network is smaller than it was when nobody had any incentive to demand that Netflix use better compression technology. Now, it's important to note that this is a more theoretical game from usage-based pricing. Right? Current usage-based pricing models are somewhat crude tools to solve the congestion problem, right? So the typical usage-based pricing model now is a cap on your monthly limit of service. And that's sort of like saying we're going to solve rush hour by limiting the number of miles you can drive each month. It may have some aggregate effect on rush hour, but it's not a solution that's targeted to solve the rush hour congestion problem. A better usage-based pricing model would be something like peak time pricing, or like London's famous traffic tax, which charges cars more to enter and exit the city during times of peak traffic. I haven't reviewed the literature on this, but my understanding is that when London started charging a commuter tax during rush hour, it lowered congestion levels in London by a considerable amount and had the nice added benefit of adding to the city's tax revenue. But peak time pricing is probably too difficult to implement in broadband, at least right now. Because to work, peak time pricing requires peaks to be predictable and to be communicated to consumers in a relatively easy to understand fashion so that consumers can change their consumption behavior accordingly. Right, so peak times are relatively predictable on fixed networks. Traffic tends to peak between 7 and 11 p.m., which is not a surprise, right? That's when you get home, you collapse on the couch, and you turn on TV and want to watch Seinfeld. Well, Seinfeld, sorry, it's an outdated example, right? But the FCC's broadband speeds their speed tests are suggesting that congestion isn't much of an issue right now, at least right now, with regard to fixed broadband networks. Tests show that consumers are typically receiving, on average, speeds that are 96% or more of what's advertised, even at peak. And so if even at peak time, broadband providers are offering speeds very, very close to their advertised amounts that consumers bought, it means that congestion generally isn't slowing down consumers right now. Now, it's not to say that congestion is never a problem for fixed broadband. Right, when the FCC sanctioned Comcast for throttling BitTorrent traffic in 2008, Comcast's stated reason was that torrenters were creating unexpected peaks in upload traffic, and they were imposing congestion costs on other users in the neighborhood who shared the same lines as the torrenting customers. And at some level, one can infer that there's some congestion on the public internet by the existence of private content delivery networks, companies like Akamai and Level 3. Right, so content delivery networks store multiple copies of a content provider's data in locations around the country and carry that data over privately owned networks rather than the public internet to a location on the broadband provider's network closest to the consumer. So if I'm a Netflix customer and I start streaming a movie, chances are the data is not going from Netflix's servers over the private internet all the way to me. Usually, Netflix has archived a copy of what I'm looking for on a content delivery network's servers, something like Akamai or Level 3, and increasingly Netflix is now building its own content delivery network. And for the most part, that data traverses these private lines that are not part of the public internet, and they only come in at the last mile, somewhere near my neighborhood, in order to go onto the public internet and over to my computer. Now, Netflix pays a cost for that, right? They rent space from Akamai or Level 3, or now I guess they're paying to build their own content delivery network. They would not incur that cost, I don't think, if they thought that their material was going to be delivered over the public internet without any congestion delay. So the fact that they're willing to create a market for private content delivery networks suggests that, at least among major content providers, congestion over fixed broadband is enough of a problem to put money at to try to solve. And more generally, right, Say's law suggests that any installed capacity will eventually become saturated. Greater network capacity drives greater demand for bandwidth-intensive applications that capacity makes possible. So broadband providers build more lanes on the information superhighway, and we come up with more things to fill that space, right? It's an iterative process. It's a good process, but it's an iterative process, meaning that congestion may be managed or brought into equilibrium for time, but ultimately congestion is going to happen, and it is a legitimate factor when making pricing determinations for broadband providers. Now, those of you who have smartphones know that congestion is a much more significant issue for wireless providers. And so when we talk about congestion as a reason for capping one's use and charging more to those who use more, it makes a lot of sense on the wireless side. Unfortunately, though, wireless networks don't display predictable peak times. Essentially, wireless networks are congested all the time, or at least congested at random periods of time that are hard to predict. And because peak time is hard to predict, it's hard to set up a peak time pricing model in a way that communicates to you and me that we should be using our cell phones now and not then, right? And so all of this means that usage-based pricing can decrease total traffic on the network, which is good for chronically overtaxed systems like wireless networks. But peak time pricing is probably not yet feasible as a solution to manage congestion more generally. So if usage-based pricing is such a wonderful thing, right? It allows us to shift network costs onto heavier users, expand access to lighter users, and potentially manage congestion down the line if we can solve the peak time pricing problem. What are some of the concerns with it? Why wouldn't we do this? And there are a number of issues that have been raised, and I want to walk through some of them because they're legitimate issues and I want to talk them through. Ultimately, I don't think they're issues that should derail the project entirely, and I'll explain why. So one is what we might call the insurance effect, or decision fatigue, right? When I get my wireless bill, I want to know that the bill is going to be the same amount every month, and I'm not going to get some unpredictably high amount because my kid went online and downloaded a movie and didn't know what he was doing, right? And related to that is the notion of decision fatigue. I get in traffic and I pick the lane, drive to work. I'm making decisions all day. I get home. I have to decide what's for dinner. When I collapse on the couch, all I want to do is watch a Saturday Night Live rerun. And I don't want to have to think about whether it's worth the additional 10 cents or 15 cents that it's going to cost me on my wireless bill, or on my broadband bill, in order to do that. And I think these are real issues. But I think that the way usage-based pricing plans are currently structured, they address those issues for most of us. Right, so most of us are not paying for broadband on a per megabyte basis, right? That every incremental activity we take incurs a cost. Rather, most of us purchase a tiered plan, a plan that allows unlimited use up to a cap. And as long as we stay below the cap, we don't have to think about incremental choices day to day. And what studies have shown is that consumers tend to choose plans with limits that are higher than the amount of data they reasonably expect to use in a given month. So I generally use about 1 gig of data on my phone, but I have a plan that allows me up to 2 gigs. And most people generally do the same thing. And that way they're willing to pay a little bit more for that insurance effect of knowing that unless I'm engaged in a substantial amount of unusual activity and therefore I'm aware I'm going to have a higher bill, I'm not going to be subject to bill shock. And it also means that the tiered plan, because the cap is so much higher than my average monthly use, it essentially gives me an unlimited flat rate plan, except for those periods of unusual spikes. And so I don't have to suffer that decision fatigue problem. And so I think while insurance effects and decision fatigue might be an issue with some kinds of usage-based pricing, I don't think it's an issue with regard to the usage-based pricing models that we see in the marketplace now. I think the bigger issue comes up with regard to using artificial scarcity in order to raise rates. Right? The idea is that companies, rather than continuing to build out networks, they cap your use and then charge overages and pocket the difference. Now this is possible, right? Some companies definitely have incentives to do that, but I think it's unlikely for 2 reasons. First of all, in a usage-based pricing system, right, the cornerstone is that the network operator is getting paid more if the customer uses more, not less. But I think more importantly, this type of model only would really work if the provider has market power. Right? Otherwise, consumers who say that's a raw deal, they switch to a different provider. But if a provider has market power, then there's no need to go through this sort of scarcity kabuki dance in order to fleece consumers. They can simply raise the rate that they charge for the unlimited flat rate plan and then pocket the difference. And so the difference is that in a usage-based pricing world, a company that tries to create scarcity forces consumers to use that scarcity more efficiently. In a flat rate world, inefficiency creates more congestion, so that ultimately the only people on the network are the ones who are willing to most tolerate congestion. Or it leads to what one commentator has called the Yogi Berra equilibrium. Networks get so congested that no one's willing to go there anymore. Finally, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road in this debate, issues of anti-competitive effects. Broadband providers using data caps in order to protect their cable affiliates from competition from over-the-top competitors like Netflix. I think there's a couple caveats to this argument. First of all, surveys show that most consumers think of Netflix as a complement rather than a substitute to cable, and that cable holds an additional value proposition above and beyond what over-the-top video providers can provide. The things like live sports and award shows that you want to watch live and you wouldn't watch over the top on a delayed basis. And secondly, right, not all companies with usage-based pricing have cable affiliates. Not all broadband providers with cable affiliates have adopted usage-based pricing, like Verizon. But no question these incentives are there. Comcast estimates that it would take 288 gigabytes a month for the average customer to replace his cable service with over-the-top service exclusively. And that's suspiciously close to Comcast's 300 gigabyte a month limit, right? So the incentives are there for a company to use market power in broadband in order to protect an affiliate in cable. But incentives alone are not enough to prompt government action, right? This is what economists would call a vertical restraint on trade. And vertical restraints on trade can be good or bad, depending on the effects. The first thing we have to do when we see something that might be anti-competitive is to ask whether the firm has market power. Otherwise, consumers that think they're getting a raw deal would simply switch to a different provider. And here the evidence suggests that, at least in most of the country, the broadband market is at least workably competitive, right? 82% of us or more have at least two providers for broadband service, and so we get a choice. Now, Fred Kahn, who was the late dean of regulated utilities law, will tell us that there's no consensus among economists regarding the sufficiency of competition under duopoly. Right, so most of us have at least two providers, but for most of us that means only two providers, right? The cable company or the phone company. And so it's not clear whether a market with two major players is going to go toward competition or cooperation. But we see in at least some evidence of competition in the broadband market, right? We see somewhere between 25 and 36% annual churn rate, so customers are actually switching back and forth between providers. And companies are increasingly willing to offer no contract plans, which suggests that companies are competing for people and customers are regularly switching. Now finally, once we get past market power, the question then becomes consumer harm. But it's important to note that the issue is harm to consumers, right? The Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that antitrust law protects competition, not competitors. Assuming for the sake of argument that Comcast is using data caps to try to prevent customers from canceling their cable service and going to Netflix, that's bad for Netflix, obviously. It's unclear whether it's bad for consumers. For a consumer that wants to cancel cable and can't, it's a bad rap. But for a consumer that's already canceled his cable service, it's probably a good thing, right? Because cable and broadband share the same fixed cost base, and every cable subscriber that drops off the network means that broadband prices are going to have to rise to offset it. And so allowing cord cutting will raise broadband prices, so preventing cord cutting may keep broadband prices lower. So all that is by way of saying it's complicated. It's much more complicated than critics make it out to be. And it's an issue that needs to be settled on a case-by-case basis rather than a per se rule. And so finally, what's the role that government plays in here? Well, first of all, government needs to be watchful for those situations where anti-competitive conduct is possible, right? I've tried to convince you today that a per se rule against broadband pricing is not a good idea, but because anti-competitive conduct is possible, you need watchdogs, people at the FTC, people who do antitrust law, to make sure that companies that have market power are not abusing them in ways that harm consumers. Another role, I think, is to perfect the transparency of information, right? Unlike cell phone minutes, it's hard for consumers to understand how their consumption translates into megabytes. And so it's important that providers provide transparent policies so customers will understand how much data they're consuming each month, with things like easy-to-use data meters that track your data progress. And the government has a role, I think, in overseeing to make sure that the information that companies are providing to consumers is accurate and complete. And my parting thought, I think, is that the current usage-based pricing debate, I think, fundamentally misunderstands the role of regulation. The takeaway from at least my analysis is that market power is your enemy if you're a consumer, not usage-based pricing as a concept. Different pricing strategies offer companies different ways to experiment with business models. Those that succeed will attract customers to their base and stick around. Those that are bad models will lose customers and be eliminated. The customer benefits from this experimentation in terms of greater choice among providers and more efficient providers in the long run. Government should really get involved only where a company has market power and wields it in a way that harms consumers. Otherwise, this experimentation should be allowed to go forward and to allow companies to figure out what the best pricing model is. And that experimentation, that best model, may differ from company to company. One size fits all is generally not a good way to price a system, and it's definitely not the right answer, I think, for an increasingly diverse internet ecosystem. Thanks.
I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first couple of questions, and we'll open it up to the audience. Could you tell us a little bit about the DOJ investigation that was opened last year?
Sure. Not a lot about the investigation has been made public. But what seemed to have prompted the investigation was a proposal by Comcast that although data you usually consume over the internet, over your broadband connection is exempt, it counts against your data cap, they're going to exempt viewing of Comcast on-demand video consumed through Microsoft's Xbox device. Not surprisingly, opponents of data caps pointed to this as an example of Comcast favoring its own content over other providers, because if you watch Netflix content through your Xbox, it counts against your cap, and if you watch Comcast content over the Xbox, it doesn't count against your cap. So the cap is incentivizing customers to choose Comcast. But I think looking closer at the actual proposal that Comcast had on the table, the situation is less clear, right? It turns out that it only applies to customers who also already pay for Comcast cable service, right? The cable service that they would be getting through a traditional cable box on their over the cable lines. And so what it essentially, and the exception only applies to Comcast content. And so for most consumers who are trying to take advantage of this cap, it's not that they're choosing between Comcast and non-Comcast content. It's a choice between Comcast content offered through the cable box and Comcast content offered through an Xbox. Essentially, it allows the Xbox to be used as a substitute cable box, which is good because it gives customers more choice in what type of set-top box they want to use. So I think when it gets down to market power and consumer harm, right? First of all, in most places in the country, you won't see a lot of market power because customers who don't like this can simply switch to another provider. Secondly, even in areas where Comcast has market power, I'm not convinced there's any consumer harm if all that's really happening is customers are saying, I wanted to watch this over my set-top box, and instead I'm watching it over my Xbox unit. And so if there's no actual harm, I don't really see where the case is. Now, the DOJ's been fairly tight-lipped about their investigation, but a lot of antitrust scholars who have talked about this issue have sort of come to the same conclusion. There's probably not a lot of there. But we'll see. They may surprise me.
All right, let's open it up to the floor for questions. Yes. And please identify yourself for the audience.
A book that's getting some press lately it's called Captive Audience by Susan Crawford. She had a piece in the Times today. I think, picking up on your point about market power, the contention that she would make, and I'd be fascinated to hear your response, is essentially, other than around here, where you can get, Comcast or Cox on the one hand, or Verizon's Fios on the other hand, consumers really don't have a choice for very high broadband speeds. That if your local phone company doesn't have fiber to your house, you're out of luck. Do you think that's true, or is she missing something about consumer choice and market power?
I appreciate the question. Susan's a brilliant scholar. She's been involved in this world quite a bit, and her contributions, I think, have been tremendous in shaping internet policy. She and I differ, I think, when it comes to assessments of the amount of competition we see in the broadband space. And I want to seize on one word that you use, and you quote her accurately. She focuses on competition for very high speed broadband. And I think by doing so, it artificially limits the universe of broadband providers, right, to essentially those cable providers who provide DOCSIS 3.0, 3.1, and potentially fiber optic through FiOS. If you look at the average, the speed tier that the average consumer buys on the residential side, I don't think all of us are flocking toward that super high speed tier, right? It's a segment of the market that is beyond what most of us typically need for our residential use in a given month. And when you expand the market to think about competition for broadband rather than very high speed broadband, you see a lot more competition. As I meant, it's hard, I think, to predict or to say with clarity what, as I mentioned earlier, right, whether even in a two-party world, whether the market is going to go toward cooperation or competition. But we see some evidence that in most places, even when all your only choices are DSL over the telephone line and the cable company, they compete one against another. One question I would ask is if, in response, is if Comcast has market power, right? What was the incentive to create DOCSIS 3.0 or 3.1 in the first place? Why would they provide very high-speed broadband if all they had to do was provide normal broadband and take advantage of customers in that way? So the fact that they're building out the network and expanding capacity, I think, suggests there's at least some competition. And all of this ignores, I think, the potential disruptive influence that wireless may bring. That's been our dream for 10 years, and 4G LTE may finally get us to the point where that's possible. That's what broke the cable monopoly, right? When we were worried about cable in the 90s, it was the same sort of argument. Cable has the bottleneck into your house. There's no other way for pay television to get in, and therefore they need to be regulated because of monopoly. Well, it turns out, right, competition didn't come from more cable companies, overbuilders. Competition came from a completely different technology doing the same thing, satellite providers. My mother-in-law in southeastern Missouri loved the day that DirecTV came online because it meant that she could finally join the advanced video revolution. 4G is what holds the possibility out for that. And in areas where 4G is not possible, satellite-based broadband is another option too. So these disruptive technologies are out there. But yeah, it really depends, I think, on how you define the market. And I think the way you should be defining the market is companies that can provide the level of service that most consumers are demanding.
Right.
Joel Bernstein with Temple Strategies. Is there any taking into account the number of devices and users on the wireline broadband? Because when you're wireless, you end up paying for each device. When you're cable, you end up getting an additional box, right? And so, but there's no accounting for if there's 1 or 10 people on that same wireline connection. So how do you sort of rationalize that?
That's a good question. Typically, right, the idea behind your broadband connection is you're paying for the wire into your home, and then wherever it splits from there is your own business. Everything used there counts toward the cap. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's definitely where the market has gone with regard to pricing. I can see a company instead charging on the basis of connection because each wireless device gets its own IP address, so it's technically feasible, I would think, to do that. The question is whether you can provide cost savings in a way that could get customers to switch to that model. But it does raise one other comment that I think is a very interesting one. And it's one that Chris Yu at Penn talks about a lot, the myth of the one internet. Right, so a lot of what we do in the internet policy space is premised on the notion that every device connected to the internet needs to be able to do all things, that all of us have infinite amount of things we want to do on the internet, regardless of whether we're accessing through a tablet or a smartphone or a laptop. And that's simply not true. Right? I use my phone for some things, and I use my tablet for others, and I use my desktop at work for different things. And so it's somewhat arbitrary, I think, to set a policy that says no matter what the device is, the rules of access need to be the same, which is what we see with net neutrality rules, and it's what we will see if data caps wind up being a reality. In other countries, Chile or Argentina, I'm going to get this wrong because I'm not familiar, right? But wireless companies are pioneering not just data cap-based mobile plans, but app mobile plans, right? So I can buy a device that gives me a certain number of voice minutes and access to Facebook. And that's much cheaper than a device that gives me unlimited internet access, right? And there's a sizable number of consumers that are probably willing to pay for not unlimited data or even unlimited things they can reach with their wireless phone, but would love to be able to check email and Facebook. Right. But that's something that we don't allow under the current net neutrality rules because that would be favoring some apps and not others. So I guess the overall theme is flexibility in pricing is a good thing and probably consumer beneficial. And I think it's unfortunate that because we're thinking largely about this myth that any connected device must do all things for all people, that we miss out on the ability to offer niche segment products like that.
I would just add to that the wireless world is moving more towards the fixed wire world in terms of pricing structures. So in the past year, you've seen the major wireless carriers move to billing independent of the number of devices. And that's similar to your analogy about going to a house. Right, but you have unlimited, you have a, right. Yes, that's correct.
Hi, so Kathy Sloan with CCIA. On the matter of consumer choice for fixed, ordinary speed, fixed broadband, you were saying cable on the one hand and telephone company on the other. For, I assume you meant DSL if you don't have fiber.
Right.
Well, but the phone companies are very public about them, about their plan to accelerate transition to all IP networks, in which they would retire their public switch phone network, including the copper lines. And in fact, you know, we've had some storm outages that have shown that how bad a state that the phone networks are in already. So how? I mean, I agree that over the past decade, there have been some years of really good competition between cable and telco, but I don't see how that's going to be sustained. So
That's very true. Competition in suburban rural areas is very different than competition in urban areas where population densities and revenues per mile of line are much greater, right? In other words, there's a reason why Verizon sold off those frontier lines. Because they tend to be less profitable. I'm just sort of wheel spinning here. My guess is that the copper lines, although they may be retired in the sense of no longer have public obligations, if there's still something that's profitable, you will find some company willing to operate them. It may not be AT&T, Verizon. It may be like a Fairpoint or a Frontier or something like that. And if not, something else I imagine would come along in order to fill that gap. You're right, in the short term, it may mean less competition as opposed to more. But when there's less competition and the potential for greater profitability, that entices someone to come along and provide a next generation service. Right? Dish Network really wants to roll out nationwide wireless broadband, and if they can get permission from the FCC, they're going to do that. And that may wind up being the answer. In those areas where it's uneconomical to continue to serve with copper and where laying fiber doesn't make a lot of sense financially. But yeah, very difficult question, or difficult issue that the FCC has to deal with. I'm very glad I'm not a regulator.
Oh, hi. David Tell. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson. You mentioned in passing that Verizon does not employ usage-based pricing. If I remember correctly, there is a tiered pricing system, but it's based on speed.
That's right.
Given the logic of your argument on behalf of database pricing, I'm given the its potential to expand access and fairness and the efficiencies with which providers can recover their fixed and marginal costs. I'm wondering, I assume the people at Verizon are familiar with this argument as well, and I'm wondering why they haven't adopted it themselves. Do you care to speculate about that?
This would be pure speculation. I haven't. I'd love to talk with the folks at Verizon about it. I haven't yet. I think the reason is because the Fios network has a tremendous amount of capacity, right? It's all fiber optics, so it can carry a lot of data, and the uptake rates have not been, I think, what they've hoped to see thus far in areas where they built out. So in other words, congestion simply is not a problem for Verizon. The national broadband speed tests show that on average consumers are getting 117% of the advertised speed, the speed that they ordered, right? It's going 20% faster than that, even at peak times. And so at least until Verizon gets more consumers to switch from the cable company to them for broadband service, they don't really need to worry about rationing access because they can take everybody. And so if they can take everybody, then that becomes a point of competition. Right, Comcast will limit you to 300 gigs per month. Come to Fios, and it's completely unlimited service. And so it just becomes a business decision as to that's how they're going to compete. I've noticed that Verizon is very careful not to take the position that usage-based pricing is bad, simply that they're choosing not to take advantage of it at this time.
If I could just add a little footnote on that. Most of the major communications companies have national pricing as opposed to local pricing, and this complicates the points that Professor Lyons was making, precisely because you might have a company that has congestion problems and say 5 or 10% of their footprint, but not on the other 90 to 95% of the footprint. And in a perfect world, they might like to go to usage-based pricing on the 10 or the 10% of the footprint that has congestion problems. But for marketing reasons, it's very difficult to have different pricing structures in different parts of the country, and so you wind up with kind of a lowest common denominator pricing structure, which, in the case of Verizon, is no data caps.
And you're right that they're using speeds in order to tier, and it winds up having a similar effect as usage-based pricing with regard to price discrimination. It segments relatively price inelastic people who are willing to pay more for better service. And so that's one way in which I think Verizon is probably reaping at least some of the benefits of price discrimination without adopting a data cap.
University of Maryland. Thank you. Hi, I'm Richard Moss, University of Maryland. And I'll just lay out preparatory concern. The concern is really at the bottom. In other words, is there a point, given user-based pricing, and I have anybody wants to watch 2 movies a day, they can pay a couple $100s a month, it's fine. But is there potential for getting something comparable to universal service before divestiture and the breakup of the bells and so on? Mm-hmm. And I think, again, it was Crawford that just noted 2 weeks ago that in Seoul, people in Seoul are paying $30 a month and very much faster broadband than we have here. I worked in Taiwan, and the way it worked for resident aliens is that it was really an open market. You went into what would have been a department store, but like a market, bought a used cell phone, went over to 7-Eleven, they gave you a SIM, and they connected to I believe it was Far Eastern, but there may have been others. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, why haven't processes like that developed in the United States?
Good question. I think you're absolutely right that the issue of usage-based pricing can't be looked at in a tunnel, right? The question of universal service is important. We need to solve. I'm a firm believer in universal service, not just for voice, but for broadband as well. I think study after study shows that access to the dominant telecommunications network provides greater civic participation levels and better informed voters. Right? It's a public safety issue. Right? So universal service is a very important commodity. And we have not yet figured out how to do it for broadband. The FCC is piloting that now, and good for them. But I think it's going to be a tough nut figuring out how to transition the old telephone universal service system to a new broadband one. The answer lies, I think, in part with a focus on the consumer. So part of the problem, I think, with current universal service is that it's like an $8 billion fund each year, and it's funded by the surcharge on your bills are like 16%, which is the rate I paid for that sucker's tax on hotel room over in McPherson Square that they use to like fleece non-residents because non-residents can't vote, right? It's a ridiculously high number. But only about 25% of it goes toward what you think of as universal service, right? Helping low-income people afford phone access. Another 25% of it goes toward providing connections at libraries, and half of it goes directly toward telco providers in rural areas, right? The appropriately named high-cost fund. It would be a mistake to take that exact system and simply say add broadband to it. I think a good universal service broadband program would be a consumer-based program, one that puts, I'm loath to use the word vouchers because it's become a dirty word in Washington, but some type like a telecom food stamp program or something like that, that puts choice in the hands of low-income consumers and allows them to participate like anybody else in a marketplace for broadband goods. So I imagine something like the FCC deciding there's an appropriate amount per month that a low-income person could pay, right? Recognizing that there's a delta between that and average market rate for what we consider base broadband. And then issuing a voucher for the difference between the two. And a company that accepts the voucher has to agree to provide broadband for no more than the voucher plus whatever contribution the FCC said was appropriate for the participant, but that the consumer could use that to buy broadband or something cheaper than that, like a voice service, a voice-only service, or as a credit toward a broader suite of telecom products. But ultimately, I think you'll notice sort of the theme of the I think you could totally do that. And I think you're seeing some version of that with regard to second-tier players like TracFone, right? The largest wireless company you've never heard of, right? They have like 24 million people because they offer a cut-rate prepaid service to folks who can't afford a shared data plan from Verizon. And they're making tremendous business. They're showing the opportunity is there, and I see, I don't know what the legal restrictions are that prohibit aftermarket cell phones and swapping of SIM cards and things like that. I don't know that there are any. It may just be the market hasn't evolved yet.
I was saying my understanding is that the customer will get phones at generally no cost to them, but they are 2 or 3 generations behind. And so only now are the wireless lifeline resellers offering smartphones because you can get the old, the old BlackBerries, the old iPhones, that sort of thing. Right.
And to the extent that we have a universal service subsidy, I think it makes sense to make it technologically neutral. Give consumers as much choice as they can and let the market decide what the right solution is to solve, to meet the needs of this swath of customers.
And with that, let's bring this to a close. Anyone who wants to come up and ask Professor Lyons more questions may afterwards. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.